Hi, my name's Howard Lyon. Welcome to my instructional video for my painting, A Young Satyress. This was a fun fantasy painting to do, painting a figure from recent mythology. There weren't satyresses in ancient Greece, but since then they've appeared in literature and in other arts. This painting is going to focus a lot on edges, and specifically losing edges, and I want to show a little bit how I did that. Before we get to that point, here is a shot of my reference so you can see my model, beautiful Kate. She's an excellent model, and here is a skull of a springbok that I happen to have and took a picture of it for the horn reference. And here is the reference put together with clouds that I just invented in Procreate, and just focused kind of on the forms of the clouds and creating shapes that I thought were interesting. They're not realistic looking, but that's okay. They gave me the shapes that I wanted. Before we get into my painting, I want to look at some Sargent's real quick. Sargent was a master at losing edges and using a balance of hard and soft edges in his paintings. And in his charcoal drawings especially, you can really see this. I want you to imagine this drawing without the lines. So look at some of the lines in the hair and imagine it without them, and you have these just soft forms underneath. Let's look at a painting of his, and we have a similar effect. We're going to zoom in here, and I want you to imagine these as just soft forms with no hard edges and no painted lines in there. And you can really see, like on the cheek as it turns into the shadow, how it just disappears. There are very few spots on this where there are strong hard edges, and especially where there's soft things like the hair, it is very just blended. Here's a wonderful charcoal portrait, and we're going to zoom in and kind of pan down it because you can see things like on his coat and around the hair, how the edges really get lost. Look at the eyes and the way Sargent chose to render the eyes, and imagine it without the lines. So take away those lines for the eyelid, and take away the lines for the iris, and look at the jaw, how it just disappears without the line. It's just kind of a soft haze where the forms are merging into the form near it. And Sargent had this wonderful balance of hard and soft edges. So let's go back to my reference image. So in here we've got some soft implied edges in the clouds and the hair and the horns, but I wanted to really exaggerate it in this painting. And so I decided to do an experiment where I'm taking my reference and I'm going to give it a 20% Gaussian blur. So now my reference that I'm going to paint from for the first half of this painting is very blurry, and it gets rid of any details that are there, or at least a lot of the details. I've never done this before. Usually I squint down at my reference to kind of remove details and reduce the value range, but I'm excited to show you this experiment, and I think it was effective, but I'll leave that to you as we go in. I'm starting this painting with acrylics. So these are golden open acrylics. The nice thing about the open acrylics is they're kind of like a middle ground between oils and acrylics, in that they stay wet and workable for quite a bit longer. They can stay, depending on how thick you paint, they can stay workable for about an hour, or even a little bit more, depending upon the pigment. And that's pretty nice. And then you can set it out in the sun, or hit it with a blow dryer, or carefully put it in a warm oven. I will preheat my oven and kill it when it gets to like 140 degrees or so. And then you can put it in your oven and kind of bake that moisture out of it and cure the acrylics. Otherwise, you almost have to wait overnight to be able to oil paint on top of it, because you definitely don't want any wet acrylics underneath. You want it to be fully dried. But for doing a quick turnaround, I needed to finish this painting in 2 days. For doing a quick turnaround, jump starting it with this acrylic ebosh is a good way to do that. Now I could have done it with oils using a dryer as well, but this is even faster in terms of the drying time. So it worked. It's good, I guess, illustration technique to throw those acrylics in underneath, and then you can go right in with oils on top of it. Now, if you're going to use acrylics, you want to make sure that you're painting on an acrylic ground, or at least not a lead or oil-based ground. And most of my canvas that I have, most of my linen, has an oil ground on it, and so I'm limited if I want to use that surface, where I will need to make sure that I'm working on an acrylic ground. So in this case, it was a tinted Liquitex Professional gesso that I worked on, and I just bought the white gesso and added some black acrylic to it to make it a nice gray. So that's where the panel got its tint from. I like working on the gray. It makes it nice for judging some of the values as you're putting those in. There's nothing wrong with painting on a white surface either. In fact, if you've watched some of my videos, you'll see I often paint on a white surface, but sometimes I'll just give it a quick tint to knock it down, and it can make judging some of the values a little bit easier, like I said. So working with acrylics, I worked with a very simple palette where I had a warm and cool of red, yellow, and blue, and then white and black and brown. So I had raw umber as my brown, and then titanium white and ivory black. So as to which reds, yellows, and blues, you just, like, I would have a cad lemon and then a cad medium or a yellow ochre. And the reds, I'd have a cad red light, and then I'd have a quinacridone red. Having a warm and cool of each of them lets you mix just about any kind of tint that you want. And so that's what I did. I had a cobalt blue and an ultramarine blue for my blues. Now I'm into oils. So I took the painting and I put it outside in the sun. It was a warm day, and it took about a half an hour to cure the acrylics to where I felt like I could work on it. So now I'm going in with oils. Now, my focus here is going to be keeping everything very soft. So it's almost like I'm going to be applying a Gaussian blur as I paint. So you can see me going in and actually blurring. I'm trying not to purely blur everything, but still mix some of those transitions, which if you've heard my videos, you've heard me proselytize quite a bit. And that is, rather than, like, if I've got the white of the cloud and the blue of the sky, I don't want to just blend the two together to make the transition, but I actually want to mix a color on my palette. That way it gives me a little more control over how that transition happens. So I've never approached it quite like this, so this was a fun new challenge to try for a painting, and I'm really excited with the results. It's something that you're going to see me do at least for a few more paintings until I decide if it is valuable, necessary, and kind of train my brain to see shapes a little bit differently. I will say that working with the reference this way definitely let me see shapes faster. You know, they were blurred shapes, but it let me identify them, I felt, quite quick. And as you see me move forward on this, I'm going to leave this reference in the upper left-hand corner so that you can kind of compare what I'm painting to what I was seeing on my reference. Of course, I've got my reference up on my iPad just to the left of my painting. You can see me glance over at it. I have my palette on a tripod my palette is a piece of glass mounted to a Strata pad sold by the company Strata. And I just Velcroed this piece of glass to it that has a flat gray primer painted on the underside of the glass that works for a great palette. I can tilt it and raise it and move it around wherever I need it to be. So again, I'm working with bristle brushes, which if you watch a lot of my past paintings, I don't use a lot of bristle brushes in my finished work. I do when I paint from life and I'm doing a little bit quicker painting. But the bristle brushes in this case help kind of keep those edges soft. I did use, once I got to the oils, like I said, I needed to do this painting in 2 days. And so I am using the Griffin Alkyd White, which starts to tack up quite quickly because it has an alkyd resin dryer built into it, almost like there's liquin or galkyd mixed into it, though it's not as sticky as either one of those. But the paint does start to get tacky, and it makes it trickier to blend. Ideally, I would have done this whole process with no dryers and using titanium white so that it would be very wet and workable throughout the entire day, because creating some of these blends right here was tricky because the background had started to get too tacky by the time I got to the hair and the horns. So doing this over, leaving myself enough time that I don't have to use a dryer, and I would have done it all with titanium. Keeping things, again, very soft and blended throughout this whole piece. I want to be able to say that I could eliminate those details in my mind without blurring the reference. And I think I'll get there with that, making it a focus. But I think I need to do this at least a few times where I'm going to blur my reference like this. And it no longer becomes an option. Even though I will tell myself, focus on the shapes, values, forms before you get to the details, they're still there. They're still present in influencing my decisions. So it was nice to remove that. Honestly, it simplified the process, and it made it so that mentally I didn't even have to consider not painting some of those elements. They just weren't available to paint. So it was quite nice. They talk about Monet as his life progressed, how his eyesight got worse, and how it had a beautiful effect on some of his Impressionist paintings. Now, I can just take off my glasses and have a similar effect. Fortunately, I can wear good glasses. But having my reference there and blurred like this has a similar effect, and a very controllable effect. And if you know anything about me from following my videos, I like process and I like control. I like things to be repeatable. That's just part of, I think, the way my mind works. So you can even see me getting in here, and I'm starting to tighten up a little bit, but you'll see me repent of this and soften it back up. So to stick with my guns on the approach that I'm going to take. This little brush that you see me using now is a synthetic evergreen from Rosemary that has absolutely been abused, and it was around, and now it's just a frayed little fuzzy stump of a brush, and it's wonderful for this. So I can go in and just scrub the paint and really create a lot of softness when I do that. As I'm getting into this form, I feel like the blurred reference is also helping me identify light fall off in the form a little bit easier. So that fall off from the forehead down to the chin, it's very subtle, but it's very important in describing the form as it sits in the light, where the point on the forehead that is closer to my light source is going to be brighter than the light facing planes on the chin, because the chin is further away from the light source. When it's blurred like this, I feel like it's a little bit easier to identify that fall off of light, and that's very useful. Something that blurring also reveals a little bit, unless you take it too far, are the planes. The planes of the face and the forms become a little more simplified, and even though they've got fuzzy edges, it's easier to identify this kind of group of color and group of value. So if you look at that reference in the upper left-hand corner, look at it and see how you might break those shapes down. You can see it in the hair, where it almost becomes two values. You have the hair that's in the light and the hair that's in the dark, and all of those brighter highlights have been blurred, and as a result kind of grouped in with the light side, and then the dark accents have also been blurred and grouped in with the mass of the shadow side. So it's really simplified the reference, which is made visualizing it and translating it into the painting quite a bit simpler as well. So hopefully that's making sense as to why this might be something that you want to try in your work. Like I said, I found it very pleasing and very effective to work with this approach. Now we're getting close. We're getting close to about, I'd say 2/3 way through the painting time. I've sped up this portion just a little bit more, but it took me about, I'd say this painting was about 20 hours, and about 16 of those hours was spent doing this underpainting, where everything was very soft and creating all of those edges. What it's going to do for me moving forward is I will then be able to go in and selectively decide where I want hard edges and where I want detail, but I also will have all of these soft edges underneath. And my thought about hard edges is that all of the edges should be soft unless you have a reason for making them a hard edge. And the harder the edge, the more attention it will draw, especially if it is paired with value contrast and color contrast. So it's just one of those tools of variation that you can use in order to describe your painting and help to emphasize certain passages for the viewer. So keep that in mind, that hard edges are very powerful and you don't want to overuse them. That is my opinion. That's not a hard and fast rule. And it comes from admiring artists like Zorn and Sargent and Sorolla, who were masters of those lost edges. Okay, so here it is. The painting is, the underpainting is done. And you can really see how soft all of these edges really are. It looks like it's been blurred, but that is, done with oils, as you saw, and keeping all of those edges soft. Now that this part is done, I can move on to starting that refining, where I will go in and start to selectively add detail. We'll zoom in a little bit so that you can get a better look at me adding the detail. And I'm kind of, I'm very much thinking of those Sargent drawings that I showed, where it kind of had this fuzz of form underneath and then line work over the top of it to define features and bring things out. And you can see how quickly just a few strokes on that eye bring it from being very soft to having a focus to it. As I experiment with this a little bit more and get a little more proficient, at this technique, I can really see it applying to painting from life, but also for finished works like this, where I'm doing an underpainting. It definitely results in a specific look that might not be what you want in your piece. So it's something to consider, you know, kind of that interplay of soft and hard edges and how you want to utilize that in the work. But this is, you know, kind of a specific look that is kind of dreamy and has a quality to it that I've admired in Sargent's paintings, and he took it much further than this. And you know, he was painting from life almost always, and using those decisions that he was making on the fly, working from life, which is a lot of fun and a wonderful challenge to do. And I highly recommend it, because you learn so much about being efficient and simplifying and looking for forms and big shapes quickly. So it's wonderful training for illustrators, for your finished studio works. It's great fun. So I kind of mess up the drawing on the eyes just a little bit. You can see they're a little bit uneven. So I'll end up going back and adjusting that and fixing it. Now that I'm working from my reference that is not blurred, the highlights are now visible along with the dark accents, and then of course all of the details of the form. And I'm still making decisions of what to paint and what not to paint, how to stylize, what to leave out and what to include. That's really, in my mind, a big part of the artistry of art, is deciding what to include and what to leave out. Otherwise, you run the risk of just becoming a copyist, even if you've created the reference, even if they're photos that you've taken. You don't want to be a copyist. You want to inject imagination in and paint things, and paint in a way that becomes your vision, your aesthetic version of reality, or an abstract vision. You've heard me in past videos talk about my hierarchy of importance: shape, value, form, color, details. And it's easy to get lost in those details and get out of sync in that step. And whenever something is wrong, like right now, to me, the eyes don't feel quite right, I go back to that hierarchy, and it helps me identify where the problems are. So even though I've got color and detail and form in place here, I will use that to go back in and look at the shapes and say, okay, where did I get off on my shapes? And how can I fix that? How can I make some adjustments there? And it's a great way to critique your work and to make necessary fixes when something gets off. So here I am going back and adjusting some of those shapes so that they now read correctly according to my model and the reference. Little changes on the eye, but they were important to make. On these horns, I found myself getting a little too perfect in the spacing of those ridges, where even though they are quite regular on the horns, there's enough kind of organic variance to them that you don't want to get locked into it and create what I call the checkerboard effect, where you impose this perfect pattern on nature. So I'll go in and kind of try and disrupt that here and there so that it doesn't look quite so perfect. And I'm trying to be careful here to not tighten up edges too much, because I don't want a ton of focus on these horns. I want them to be, the supporting actor, so to speak, and let her face dominate and pull in the most attention. So you'll see me add some detail and then fuzz it out, and add some detail and fuzz it out, and kind of go back and forth with it. Even the clouds, I don't want all soft edges everywhere. And so I go in and I'm defining some of these shapes and letting my imagination take over with these clouds, and just create shapes that I think are pleasing, and then work on the forms so that they feel like dimensional clouds. This cloud ended up feeling like a snail almost, because it has this spiral kind of snail shell shape on top of it. And that was kind of fun to see that emerge from the painting. It's really, I felt, interesting to juxtapose these invented semi-real, and I say semi-real because they don't necessarily look like real clouds, but the way the forms are rendered is based upon real life. To juxtapose those with this realistic human face that's clearly fantasy because it has the horns added to the anatomy of it. If you're going to try this, I blurred my reference 20 pixels, but if you're working bigger or smaller, that may not be the appropriate amount. What you'll want to do is blur it until it feels like you lose those fine details, but not blurred so much that it just becomes a big soft mess. You want to visualize the painting in the end and think of how soft you might want those edges to be. So what could be useful is to look at some Sargent paintings or a painter that you admire that has very good control over those hard and soft edges, and look about how soft they are, and then soften your reference, blur your reference until it gets kind of close to that point. See that gradient on the hair on that left-hand side, that piece that went down. Oh, I'm glazing in a little bit of blue over the background that had cured at that point, because I was using the Griffin Alkyd white. And then I decided this eye still wasn't quite right, so I went and scumbled some paint over it, and now I'm fixing those shapes again. The eyes are so important. I really wanted to focus on them and get them right. Back to what I was saying, that gradient on the hair. Gradients of light are very effective ways to give a sense of light fall off. So are temperature gradients. And you can see on her figure, I have a temperature gradient going from her head, which is much warmer, and then by the time you get down to her arm and chest, the colors have become a lot cooler, and the shadows start to get more blue and gray in them, versus up closer to her eyes and mouth, the shadows are quite a bit warmer. So here's the finished piece where it's been captured, and you can see kind of that fall off of temperature that I mentioned, and you can see how I was able to keep a lot of the soft edges that were in the hair. And then you can see where I went in, like on the right hand side, and I just added a few strokes to indicate some individual strands of hair, and that was it. And all of that kind of soft space and all of those soft forms and edges underneath are still visible and working to create this kind of nice dreamy effect. But look through the painting and you'll see areas where I've painted hard edges over soft edges, and some where I've preserved both, and somewhere I've created a new hard edge and eliminated the soft edge. Well, thanks for taking a look at this video. I hope that you found it useful. As you do your own paintings, please tag me on social media. My social media handle is Howard Lyon Art on Twitter and Instagram. That way I can see them and comment them and retweet and share. Good luck with your painting, and I can't wait to see what you do. Until next time, thanks again. Bye-bye.